It's my pleasure on behalf of the organisers now to welcome Liz Weaver to the stage. Liz leads a learning centre in Canada which provides strategic direction for the design and the development of learning activities to co-generate knowledge and become a collective force for social change. Liz today is presenting her keynote entitled From Vision to Reality, How Collective Impact Can Transform Communities. Can we please make welcome Liz Weaver.
Okay, thank you. Do that official handshake. So you see I have my phone with me. And I'm surprised to see that Nigel and I are the two people tweeting this conference, and we invite all of you to tweet. We kind of came up with a hashtag that we hope you'll use, which is Every Child Succeeds. And so those of you that are on Twitter, get the message out, because there are 500 of you in the room, but we really want to have as many people get this message out far and wide, not only here in Tasmania, but to my colleagues in Canada, to Nigel's colleagues in Leeds, and internationally as well. That's the power of having not only the conversations that we're going to have over the course of the next 2 days, but it's actually an international conversation where communities are really focused on working for the best outcomes for children and their families. And that's a bit of the story that I'm going to tell you today. First, to tell you a little bit about the organization that I work for. It's an organization that's based in Ontario, Canada, halfway between Toronto and Niagara Falls, if any of you know the geography of Canada. I work for an organization called Tamarack. To some degree, I'm going to tell you the Tamarack story, but I'm also going to tell you the story of the role I played previously to joining Tamarack, a story of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. I was the director, not unlike the role that Nigel played in Leeds, but I was the director of the Hamilton Roundtable. And it's really interesting that this morning you're going to hear two different stories, and yet there's lots of contextual similarities and lots of lessons that we've both learned along our journey that we hope will be helpful to the work that's going to happen here in Tasmania around Every Child Succeeds. Tamarack is an institute where we follow 5 big ideas and 2 practice areas. And we really want to see how these ideas play out in these 2 practice areas. One of the practice areas is place-based. It's really focusing on place-based poverty reduction. We initially worked with 13 cities, of which Hamilton was one of the 13 cities. And we wanted to see, because in Canada the reality was that despite the federal government in 2000 saying we're going to reduce child poverty, despite lots of big kind of talk about it, we actually never really moved the needle all that much on poverty. And so Tamarack said, in the early 2000s, what if we took a place-based approach? What if we engaged citizens and really looked at the level of neighborhood or city? Could we actually begin to move the needle on poverty? And so vibrant communities started, and Hamilton was one of those 13 cities of which I'll tell you the story. The second area of practice that we're focused on and really interested in is how to engage citizens or re-engage citizens in talking about the hopes and the dreams that they have for their communities, and then what they can do as leaders, how they can be empowered to move those hopes and dreams forward. And that work is called Deepening Community. And it's the kind of mashup of the 5 big ideas: collective impact, community engagement, community development, collaborative leadership, evaluation, and the practice that actually makes Tamarack the organization that it is. We work pan-Canadian, which means we work across Canada, and we also work with folks in the United States, particularly around the area of collective impact. And it's a particular passion of mine. I've been really interested in collective impact and how, as a framework, it can give us language and it can give us a way of organizing that can be transformative, and to watch how communities are utilizing this framework to move community change forward. So that's the organization that I work for. So I'm going to start off this talk by telling you a little bit about collective impact. I just want to see a kind of a raise of hands in the room. How many of you know about collective impact, that you've read the articles or you've heard people talk about it. Okay, so we've got good knowledge about it. I'm only going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the framework, and then I'm going to tell you the Hamilton story and how the two kind of have flowed together. These are 5 important questions for you to ask yourselves if you're thinking, you know, the work that we're doing sounds a lot like collective impact, or we think we might use the collective impact approach to drive community change forward. And we're seeing in Canada and the United States, and even here in Australia and New Zealand, lots of different collective impact initiatives emerging. A lot in the area of children and youth, but similarly we're seeing them focus around poverty and homelessness and food security, the arts, the environment, so they're really crossing a whole variety of different contexts and of different kinds of paradigms and of different sized communities as well. So we've seen collective impact initiatives take place in cities as large as 10 million in Toronto, in the Toronto area, or in New York and Chicago, which cities are even larger, but we've also seen them take place in really, really small and rural communities where the citizens are trying to say, could we try something different? Could we try something in a more collective and an intentional kind of way? These 5 questions, I think, are really important, and Nigel referred a lot in his talk about child-friendly leads, about the importance of outcomes and the importance of measures. And so the first question that collective impact asks us is, you know, to what degree do we want to move the needle on something? And, you know, in Hamilton, that was a very difficult conversation for us. We had a philosophy that any level of poverty was unacceptable, and so when we had that conversation about did we want to move the needle 5%, 10%, or 20%, we actually landed on 100%, because if in our statement poverty is unacceptable, it's unacceptable for everyone. And so, but that's a tough conversation, because some folks in the room will say, you know, I think that 25% is doable. And so, you know, I think it is a critical conversation. The second point is really, are we in it for a longer term investment, whether it's 3 to 5 years or even longer? Some of the problems that are facing our communities, or the challenges, are, you know, generational challenges, and so to think that a 1-year program will solve that generational challenge is unrealistic. And so, you know, from a collective impact perspective, when you're joining a table, you have to think about, okay, so how long can I commit myself and my organization to this work? Can we be in this work for a minimum of 3 to 5 years? And what will it really take to, you know, move the needle on the issue that we're trying to move the needle on? And the other thing I think in this series of 5 questions that's really important is and I think Nigel talked a lot about it when he shared with you the lead story, is, are we really committed to having the voice of people with lived experience, the voice of children and their families at the table? And to what degree will we embrace that voice? Because these are individuals that are facing challenges in their lives on a daily basis. And then how do we truly and intently listen and bring that voice in a way that it not only transforms the nature of the relationships of all of those folks around the table, but it transforms the work and the approach that we're taking in our collective impact effort. So it's one of my favorite slides in this presentation. We often think about our work as being relatively linear, and yet, you know, in community change work, whether it's collaboration or collective impact, that work is actually, you're scaling mountains, you're building boats, you're crossing rivers. You know, it's actually quite variable work, and we have to be flexible and adaptive. The folks who wrote the articles about collective impact and actually devised the framework, one of the authors' names is John Kenya, and when he talks about collective impact, he talks about collective impact as being positive and consistent progress at scale. And I think that that's really important when we're thinking about community change work. What is the positive and consistent progress that we are making at the scale in which we're working, whether it's the scale of a neighborhood, the scale of a city, the scale, the scale of a county, the scale of a region, the scale of a state, or the scale of a country? What's that positive and consistent progress that we're making over time and at the scale in which we're working? And that's a really important question to ask ourselves. And I think it's a great question for collective impact. It's an equally compelling question if you're doing collaborative work. So this is kind of the meat of collective impact. There are 3 preconditions to collective impact, and in the first article that appeared in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, the folks at FSG wrote about these 3 preconditions, but not much has been written about them since. But I think they're important. I think they're critical. They're how you start this work. And the preconditions look at influential champions. So if we want to make sure that every child succeeds in the Tamar Valley region, who are the influential champions that at some level we have to bring into this work? They might be at our leadership table, they might be, elected officials at any level of government, they might be significant business leaders in the community, but who are those folks that have to be touched by this work? And I love the fact that the Leeds example brings in the rugby players and the athletes and that kind of thing. It's really kind of thinking about, who are the people, those 75,000 people that they identified that touch the lives of our children, and then how do we actively engage with them? And I think it's not only the influential champions that we want to engage, but we also want to engage their sphere of influence. And so I love the fact that we have, between 400 and 500 folks here, because each of you has a sphere of influence. And just imagine, if you're wanting to do this work here in Launceston and the Tamar Valley, if you really want to do this work, think about the power that we have in this room in terms of not only you all as leaders, but your spheres of influence that you bring to this work. You could do this stuff. You could actually significantly change the outcomes for children and their families in this area. The second precondition is around urgency of issue. So how do we know that this issue is urgent and important to our communities? What kind of conversations are happening around children and their families? Are people talking? What are they saying? What are children saying? What are youth saying about the focus on children and their families in terms of this region? That's a critical one. Urgency of issue actually has 3 components to it. The first component is data. What's the data telling us? The second component is who's already doing what in our community around this issue, and I think that that's why that building block map is so critical, right? All of you are doing things, and that gives you that kind of capacity of knowing what's going on already and where the leverage points are. And then the third is, what is that conversation that's happening, and how do we connect the data to the conversation that's happening in the community and create that sense of urgency? So that's the second precondition. And then the third precondition is adequate resources. And I know that your minds go right away to financial resources. Do we have the financial resources to truly move the needle? I would argue that you do. If you look at everybody in the room, the folks that are engaged with children and youth, you probably have overabundance of resources. You might not feel it on a day-to-day basis, but add up the collective resources. And what if we were to align those collective resources in a way that truly made a difference for children and youth in our communities? So adequate resources is, of course, financial resources, but it's also human resources. It's also that factor that is so pivotal for this community change work. What will it take from a human resource perspective to move this needle? Preconditions critical to this work. I can see that this scarf is going to move a couple of times over the course of the next couple of minutes. I'll just do it this way. The second, and I guess the meat of collective impact, is this notion of these 5 conditions. And when we talk about collective impact, this is probably what you all recognize, right? The 5 core conditions of the framework. And I would say, and I've written about this in terms of some of the articles that I published in The Philanthropist, that these 5 conditions, while they're relevant to collective impact, if you're involved in collaboration, They actually can improve your collaborative outcomes if you pay attention to them. The first condition is that of a common agenda, and I think the lead story, the child-friendly lead story, is a really interesting story because they had a plan in a page. That was their common agenda, and I think it's critical that, you know, the folks that you're working with in Every Child Succeeds here in the Tamar Valley, you have to have this common agenda, and the 6 building blocks actually frame very nicely the elements of the common agenda. Having it in one page can be really pivotal and can really be that thing that draws people in, draws resources in from the community. The second condition of collective impact is shared measurement. What are the measures that will show that we are making that positive and consistent progress over scale? And how are we going to know that? Of the 6 priority areas that you've identified, what is one measure, 1 or 2 pivotal measures in those priority areas that you want to focus on? And I think that that's really critical. Nothing builds momentum like momentum, which is kind of crazy, but it does. So as you can begin to see things shifting and changing, shared measurement really is one of those momentum builders. The third condition of collective impact is mutually reinforcing activities. That's where all of you in the room are so pivotal. We know that in any community across Australia, across Tasmania, across Canada, there are lots of people engaged in really good work and really powerful work that is impacting the lives of individuals and families, but sometimes that work is isolated and fragmented. Mutually reinforcing activities actually asks all of us to look at the world in a different way, to look at the world from a systems perspective and to say, what is the work that I'm doing right now, and how can it contribute to every child succeeding? How can my work be pivotal to that? And where is the alignment of the mission of my organization, the vision of my organization, and the potential alignment? I love the condition of mutually reinforcing activities because it says we don't need to create new things. We need to leverage those things that already exist in our communities, much like you heard in the lead story. If you do that, you have to communicate with people, and so continuous communications is the 4th condition of collective impact, and it really is saying if we're going to get lots of folks involved from all different layers of our community, if we want to target the influential champions, if we want to measure our progress and let people know about our progress, if we want to share our successes, if we want to have mutually reinforcing activities, we have to talk not only to the folks around our core table, but we have to reach out deeply and deeply and deeply into our communities and really talk to just about anybody who cares about children and their families. And, in the community that I live in, the city of Hamilton, a city of about 500,000 people, we talk to anyone who would talk to us. And so it was, church basements and university classrooms and organizational annual general meetings and people on the street and people in in coffee shops, just about anybody. And that's really engaging them in a conversation about what does it mean to be our moniker, as you'll see, was making Hamilton the best place to raise a child. So what does it mean to be the best place to raise a child? And then finally, this whole idea of backbone infrastructure or backbone support. This really is about moving the collaborative effort or the collective impact effort from the side of the table to the middle of the table. To say, you know what, we are not satisfied with the outcomes that we're achieving for children and their families currently. We've got to change the game. We've got to actually put some attention to this, and so by doing that, we're going to invest in people like Nigel and people like me who led the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, and folks here in your communities in terms of really putting a focus on the backbone and really stewarding the work forward. Now, I would say that collective impact as a framework hangs very nicely together, and what the folks at FSG, the folks who thought about collective impact in the first place, did was they gave us a framework and language that's really quite accessible. But in some ways, they actually codified the work that was already going on in communities. And so if you read that first article about collective impact, they cited a couple of examples. An international example, Strive in Cincinnati, which is a cradle-to-career educational initiative, the Elizabeth River Project, and Communities That Care. And all of those examples were things that were already going on in certain communities, in Cincinnati, in New Jersey, in Ghana. And they looked at those examples and they said, you know, these things are different than how funding was flowing to communities, which is individual organizations were getting individual pots of money and really working at isolated impact. And I think they gave us a great gift. The codifying of work that was going on actually resonated with a lot of people. And I think probably if you've read those articles or if you thought a little bit about collective impact and you thought about the work that you're doing, you're saying, yeah, sounds a lot like the work that we're doing. And it did to us in Hamilton. When we read that first article that appeared in 2011, we started our work in 2007. And it kind of said, oh my goodness, we were looking for a framework, and the framework appeared. It's kind of like that Sufi wisdom, right? When you look for the when you look for the teacher, the learning will come. And so that, for us, was very, very helpful. So now I'm going to pivot into the story in Hamilton. And as I said, the work of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction was really an attempt to say, from a place-based perspective, in this city of 500,000 people, could we move the needle on poverty, particularly for children and their families that were living in poverty in the city of Hamilton? And it's been a really interesting journey. To give you a little bit of context for the city of Hamilton, we are a city of 500,000, as I mentioned, a highly steel-focused city, a manufacturing city, and in Canada, the bottom has really fallen out of the steel market. It happened even though we've gone through lots of cycles of good income and bad income. In the last, I would say, 10 years or so, the bottom has really fallen out. And so that hit Hamilton early, before the latest kind of financial depression, and it actually had a pretty significant impact. But really, the history of urban poverty in Hamilton is a long history. It's been with us since the 19th century. One of the things that I've realized as I've done work in community change and work around collective impact is that understanding your community's narrative, understanding your regional narrative, or understanding your state narrative is really, really important. Because if you want to change that narrative, you have to have a deep and kind of visceral understanding of the narrative. And so Hamilton is one of those cities that we had lots of industrial crises, but we also are a city that, you know, is pretty resilient. Despite all of these things, we kind of keep moving forward with dirt under our fingernails, with our iron lunch buckets, and we keep going to the work. We did have a Great Depression that hit the community, and lots of different kinds of responses to that. That was kind of the resiliency element. We were on the home front really looking at how we embraced veterans in the, after the wars. We actually in Canada also really looked at how Canada was responding to how we care for each other and how we really care for the citizens across the country. And so it's really interesting to think about not only the history of the local community, but also the history of Canada. At one point, Canada is really well known for, the work of Tommy Douglas, who you see in this picture, and, really thinking about an ethic of having a social conscience, really caring for one another. But then welfare became a bad word. And so we now don't even call it welfare, we call it social assistance, right? So we've changed the vernacular across Canada, and other priorities began to occur. Hamilton was really hit hard in this kind of changing economic context. And so you can see the steel mills in the background of this picture. We used to have a city where the 2 steel mills that we had employed, I think roughly between 30,000 and 40,000 individuals, and they were really high-paying jobs. They were jobs that you would go to out of high school, and you would be basically set for life if you got a job in one of the steel mills. Over the course of the last number of years, those steel mills, one steel mill closed completely, and the other steel mill now employs less than 6,000 individuals. What's really also been interesting is for those folks that entered into the steel industry, right out of high school, those individuals are far harder to employ because they don't have post-secondary experience. They have the deep manufacturing experience and the skills that are related to that, but not transferable to other kinds of jobs that are emerging in the community. So there were some key challenges of all this history and all this background. There were some key challenges that were really facing the community from a poverty perspective. And what's really interesting is that there is a pivot point, I believe, in every community where you start to say it's not good enough anymore. And so Nigel talked about the inspectors coming to Leeds and giving their assessment of Leeds, and that became a pivot point. Something has to change. In Hamilton, we had an equally compelling kind of pivot point, and there was a report that was developed by the Social Planning and Research Council that was presented in front of City Council, and basically the report looked at incomes and poverty. And it started to lay out how pervasive this high level of poverty was on the community and what that meant in terms of overall incomes for people across the community, and also employability and some of those economic development factors that were related to the community. It seems kind of innocuous that one report would have such a big impact, but it was kind of that point where, the mayor said, we have to do something about this. This is no longer acceptable for us as a community to deal with this. And, the typical response was, or at least the typical response in Hamilton was, well, let's set up a mayor's task force. And, we had a general manager of community services, her name is Joanne Priel, and she said, a mayor's task force really lays all of this work at the foot of the city. It lays the poverty issue only at the foot of the city. And we have lots of problems at the city. So let's think about a different kind of approach. What if we imagined bringing lots of different folks around the table? And yes, the city would play a role, but the city, it wouldn't be the mayor's task force. It would be a community-led task force with lots of different voices at the table. Imagine that, and imagine what could be different. So, the next thing was that the community came together. And the initial kind of convening of the folks around the Poverty Roundtable began in the conversations about this possibility began in early 2005. And it really was this whole notion of trying to address the unacceptable levels of poverty in the community. Members were brought together from 3 different sectors initially. And we had an advisory committee of people with the lived experience of poverty. One of the biggest mistakes that we ever made at the Hamilton Roundtable was that we didn't include that voice from the very get-go, and we learned a lot of lessons around that. But it was really important to bring a diverse range of voices together, the business leaders, the not-for-profit or the community sector leaders, and individuals from government to start to really talk about, the deep implications of poverty in our community. Our challenge was that we, at the time that we started this work, had one of the highest rates in Ontario in terms of poverty. So the realities were there, the numbers were there. It was pretty clear that we were tied for first, and that's not a good place to be tied for, but we had lots and lots of levels of poverty. One of the first pieces of work that we did as part of the Poverty Roundtable is that we worked with our Social Planning and Research Council and did a poverty matrix. We looked at not only the levels of poverty that were in the community, but also the depth of that experience for different segments of our community. And so what did it mean if you were in part of the Indigenous community? What did it mean? What was your experience if you were a newcomer to the city of Hamilton? What did it mean if you were a child and or a youth that was living in our community and lived in a family that was experiencing poverty? And so you can see see there the numbers. The numbers are pretty stark. Of a city of 500,000 people, 96,000 people were living in poverty at the time when we started this work in Hamilton, which is a pretty staggering amount. As the Roundtable began to do its work, began to have serious conversations about this, we came up with this statement. And I think this statement is a very kind of powerful statement, which is the statement that they wrote together, that we stand together as a community to find solutions to poverty that will truly bring prosperity to Hamilton. We come together to act comprehensively and systemically to tackle the root causes of poverty. This was before collective impact, the collective impact framework happened, but it actually formed a really pivotal part of our common agenda. You know, we didn't know it at the time, but it was pivotal to our work. And this appeared not only on every single agenda. Anytime you attended a roundtable meeting, whether it was, you know, a meeting of the roundtable itself, or a community meeting, or a consultation, we had this statement on our agenda, and we asked a person at that meeting to read out this statement. So it became kind of our mantra for the work going forward. Our role, we really saw our role as not actually delivering new programs and services, but really bringing the community together, really bringing lots of folks to the table. Because, you know, the reality was that in the early 2005 period, 2005 to 2007, even though we knew that the level of poverty was quite high in our community, if you were to ask the general population, or if you were to ask, you know, in some cases our elected officials or others about the level of poverty, they didn't want to talk about this issue, right? Because they felt like if we shined a light on poverty in Hamilton, it would actually make Hamilton a less attractive place for employers. It would be a less attractive place to kind of, for government to make investments in. And so they wanted to shy away from this conversation, and they wanted to actually move to the other side of the coin, which was the prosperity conversation. But we, you know, stuck to our guns as a community and said, no, 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 this issue is too pervasive, it's too important. We really need to talk about it. We really need to name poverty. It has to be part of, you know, the way the Roundtable looks at its work. Here's just kind of how the data around poverty looks in Hamilton. This came out of the poverty matrix, and this was something that we shared very broadly with our community. It showed, you know, the different experience of poverty in our community, and, you know, we had pushback. So people would say to us, you know, we were going to deal with this issue of poverty, and other people would say, well, if they just got a job, if those people just got a job, and we were able to use the data to say, well, you know, 26% of them do have jobs. They're working poor. They're working probably 2 and 3 part-time jobs just trying to make the ends meet. You know, 25% of them are children under the age of 13, and, you know, Canada's laws are that you actually can't have a job. 17% of them are seniors. Those folks have already had jobs. So it allowed us to actually break down some of the stigma and some of the myths behind, you know, what people thought of individuals who were living the experience of poverty. Nigel shared with you the one-page, one-plan approach, which I love. I love that language. This was our approach in Hamilton. This was our theory of change, and I think just as we've seen with Every Child Succeeds, the investments across 6 critical areas, we had the same kind of an approach. But we took much more of a life plan approach, or a life course approach. And so our aspiration was to make Hamilton the best place to raise a child. Very much mirrors Every Child Succeeds. But we also saw that, and you see kind of bubbles across the top of this slide, those are 6 critical points of investment in the lives of children, youth, and their families in Hamilton. And our theory was that if we could begin to get the broad resources in our community really investing across these 6 critical points, we could move the needle for children and their families that were living in poverty. And the 6 critical points are pretty obvious, right? They're investments in the early years, investments in the school years, investments in that period from school years into high school and then into employment. So how do we help kids be successful, children and their families be successful through that transition period? And then the final investment really started to look more at the families, that whole idea of asset building, wealth creation, because lots of research tells you that as families begin to, have savings programs for their kids, they begin to envision the possibility of their children going on to post-secondary education of some sort. Or if families have savings accounts, they're better able to navigate some of those crises that we all have in all of our families. And so really thinking about asset building and wealth creation was pretty pivotal to the work. The roundtable actually had 5 value statements that really drew our work forward. One was that we were in it for the longer term. Another one was that we were really going to act comprehensively and focus on root causes. And then the one that I actually love the most, but is also a very difficult one to enforce when you're working in the domain of poverty, was this no blame, all accountable concept, right? And so we really believe that, it's very easy to blame people who have the lived experience of poverty, but it's equally easy to blame government for its lack of resources, or blame the community sector for not providing programs and services in the areas where they're most needed, or to blame the business community for not providing jobs at a level where people can enter into the workforce and have well-paying and sustaining jobs. So, in fact, when you get into the blame game, you can get into the blame game blaming everyone. And so we wanted to change that conversation. We wanted to say, we're going to ask some really hard questions in this work, but we're not going to blame anybody. We're not going to go to that level of conversation. The other thing that I think is really important is that we had 3 core strategies that really guided the work. The first strategy was that the work of the roundtable was going to focus on policy and systems change. We didn't need to be programmatic in our approach. We had lots of groups and lots of partners in each of the critical points of investment that were leading out on that. So that gave us the freedom to say, here's an opportunity for us to focus on this policy or focus on this system and really try to see if we can influence that change in a pretty pragmatic and tangible way. We also had partners in each of the critical points of investment, and we had shared outcomes with each of those partners. And so those shared outcomes looked at things like screening for hearing and sight in the early years. And we learned as we were working with that partner, it was called the Best Start Network. It was a partner of about 75 agencies and government and the police that were sitting around the Hamilton Best Start Network table. In some of their work, they found that children were being screened only at the level of kindergarten. And in some of the poorest neighborhoods, that screening for sight and hearing didn't happen until well into the school year. And so they said, could we get to different outcomes if we did that screening early? What if we did that screening in those neighborhoods when the children were 3 years old? What difference would that make? Well, it made a surprising difference, because when they got screened earlier in their lives, they actually had supports that provided them with glasses and audio supports, or it helped them actually improve their speech and the speech and all that kind of thing. So those children that were often the children that had more barriers in the kindergarten years in terms of being ready to enter school, they actually were more ready to enter school. An easy shift to do, because screening was part of the work that was already going on in the community, but we changed the paradigm from having that screening happen within the school setting to having that screening happen within neighborhoods, and that made a transformative change in terms of the early development index, or the early learning scores. So that was an example of one of those changes in critical points of investment, where it was led by our community partner. And then our third area, and this one, we actually fell into this third strategy more than really thought about it intentionally at the beginning, and Nigel talked about the ripple effects of unintended outcomes, which I love, and I think that this is one of those. So we said, you know, there's lots of people in our community doing very valuable work. We want to honour that work, and we want to bring it together under the banner of making Hamilton the best place to raise a child. And so we called those community solutions. And so if you were doing something in the community and you felt like that as a collaborative effort was actually making a pretty significant difference, you could become a community solution. And we didn't have any money to give you, but we could give you lots of promotion, and we could actually celebrate the successes that you were having and share that with elected officials and share that with funders. And we started with 35 community solutions that slowly grew to over 175 of these community solutions that involved more than 10,000 organizations across the community. And the range of community solutions were everything as simple as the newspaper adopting a local school and giving release time to the reporters during the course of the school day to actually go into that school and read with the children in that school or support their learning activities over the course of the school year, right through to Hamilton. If you don't know much about the geography, we are right on the corner of Lake Ontario, and because we're a steel mill, you have to get the steel. You used to have to get the steel out of Hamilton in a really simple way, and so lots of boats come into Hamilton and pick up the iron ore or bring iron ore product to the community. And so we have a lot of port companies that have grown up as a result of that. Those port companies exist right on the edge of one of the poorest neighbourhoods in Hamilton. And so the port companies were so engaged with the idea of making Hamilton the best place to raise a child that they said, you know, we know this North End neighbourhood is one of our more challenged neighbourhoods. We're going to commit over the next 5 years to raise $500,000 and invest it directly in this North End neighbourhood, in the schools, in the churches, in the children's support groups in this North End neighbourhood, and see if we can change the outcomes for the children that are our neighbours. So, you know, I think when you have something like Every Child Succeeds, like child-friendly leads, like making Hamilton the best place to raise a child, what you're actually doing is you're bringing a community together under a banner, and you're unleashing capacity that you thought might exist in your community but didn't fully know that it existed. And, you know, my favorite story that I tell is I was driving one day at Christmas time to a meeting, as you do, you know, and I was listening to talk radio, and the talk radio was, "What are you going to do for Christmas?" And a fellow got on talk radio and he said, you know, I'm from this church in Stony Creek, and we're going to make Hamilton the best place to raise a child. This is how we're going to do it. And he told his story. That church had never contacted us. They were never part of, you know, our community solutions, but they were challenged with this idea, and they were empowered to do something. And I think that that's kind of the magic of this work, is when people embrace it and people see that there's this opportunity for change, where you have had that continuous communication in such a way that the communication comes back at you, right? And people want to tell their stories and are inspired to do even that little bit more to change the lives of children and families in your community. So some of the early bottom line results that we saw was really this kind of unprecedented engagement of folks around our community. We saw this working with a range of partners across these critical points of investment. We saw more effective services being delivered. We saw more thoughtful approaches. We saw this movement towards shared outcomes. And, you know, one of the core partners that we had from the very beginning was our newspaper, our local newspaper. And we had some pretty impressive leadership at our local newspaper. And we feel very fortunate that they stepped out beyond their boundaries. Doesn't often happen. Papers in Canada are pretty conservative, and they actually faced a lot of pushback at the very beginning of their commitment to the work of the Hamilton Poverty Roundtable and the commitment to moving the needle on poverty. But the managing editor of the paper, said, Hamilton is our community. These stories happen all the time in our community, and we need to actually broadcast these stories, the good things about poverty, the bad things about poverty, and the progress that that needs to be made. They partnered with our local university, and they published a 12-page supplement, which is pretty significant, looking at data about the city of Hamilton. And what they were looking to do was they were looking to change the conversation about the pervasiveness of poverty in the community. Code Red was the name of the supplement, and it was actually stunning, the data that they found. And so if you lived in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Hamilton and your colleague lived in one of the richest neighborhoods in Hamilton, the difference in lifespan was, I believe, 21 years. 21 years. You were going to die 21 years earlier if you lived in the poorest neighborhood. And so that's unacceptable. That's unacceptable in any kind of community. And it actually was pretty significant. And in the Code Red supplement, there was lots of data about the community, but there was also lots of stories about those neighborhoods where things were really bad, and they were stories of hope. There was that voice of individuals and neighbors and children that were really saying, yes, our neighborhood has lots of these difficult data dimensions, but there's also lots of really good things happening in our neighborhoods. We also knew as we were going through our work, and Nigel said, I love what he said, that they stuck with their plan in Leeds. We actually didn't. We had the essence, the core plan is still the core plan, but we were very adaptive and malleable. And so we looked at opportunities that existed, areas of influence, and really the roundtable was really looking at those opportunities for policy and systems change. And so, yes, we still have at the core of the work making Hamilton the best place to raise a child, but we've done it through many different lenses. And we still move forward in the critical points of investment, but the roundtable's focus has actually broadened a little bit to really be quite tactical and quite strategic on policy and systems change. And so an action plan came forward, and these were kind of the elements of the action plan that really started to drive the second phase of the work. It was really to change the attitudes of poverty. We knew that as we were talking to the community quite broadly, that yes, we were engaging them in the conversation, but we had to be much more strategic about it. And we had to actually, not from the roundtable's perspective, engage people in the conversation. It was really from the focus of, people with the lived experience. What was their conversation, and how could we support that, and how could we bring that conversation forward? We really wanted to focus on and address this notion of income disparity, because despite the fact that we were actually trending in the right direction, that we were actually seeing a decrease in the net number of people living in poverty, the results of the recent economic recession was that there were increasing levels of income disparity, not only in the city of Hamilton, but across communities right across Canada. We also really wanted to really involve citizens in community life and promote innovation that was happening in the community. So under the deep understanding of poverty, we again engaged the newspaper, and you can see Code Red. Subsequent to Code Red, they published another supplement called Born, which really looked at the life trajectory of children from low-income families that were born with low birth weights, and what that meant over the life course, and what could we do as a community to begin to respond to those. And so really living up to their role as a organization that was contributing to the work of the Roundtable. We also started to look at more deeply with our partners this whole idea of income disparity, and really test how we could get at kind of narrowing the income gap across the community. And so here's an example of working with multiple partners, the university, the city, the school board. The school board actually moved forward, the two school boards. We have a Catholic school board and a public school board, and they moved forward quite intentionally with their partners in creating core curriculum that started to address this whole notion of income disparity in our communities and the impact of that on learning. Speak Now Hamilton was an initiative, again, led by folks across the whole community. So we engaged the university, we engaged our local community college, but most importantly, we engaged citizens with the lived experience. And we worked with them to really understand the stories, their experiences, and then help them figure out how to tell their stories in an intentional way and an impactful way, and one that didn't actually, in a way that didn't lead to more vulnerability for them, but that could really help, not showcase, but could help us really explain that individual experience of poverty in Hamilton. And so by the summer of 2016, we had more than 200 presentations that were done by the leaders of Speak Now Hamilton. What was really interesting was how this was shifting the conversation in the community and how it was also shifting for the individuals that were engaged in Speak Now Hamilton in terms of the work. Another big focus of our work was around living wage, and living wage is really not only looking at what the impact of minimum wage, and this is again around the income disparity, but what does it take for a family of 2 adults and 2 children to live effectively and live well in the city of Hamilton. And so living wage has been a big movement in the UK. We were following the work of the Living Wage UK work, which was not only focusing on key institutions, but really asking all employers to step forward and make a commitment to pay a living wage. And so that really informed some of the work in the city of Hamilton. We were trying to shift the conversation from minimum wage to living wage. And what's really interesting is when you have a number of communities, not only Hamilton, but a number of communities across a province, across the country, really talking about living wage, the conversation about minimum wage also starts to change. That's one of those splash and ripple effects. We now have one province, the province of Alberta, where the minimum wage is $15 an hour. And for many communities, $15 an hour is a living wage. It's a living wage. I think the living wage in Hamilton is now $17 an hour. So it's kind of slightly below that. But it's really interesting to see how all provinces across Canada have moved the minimum wage conversation forward. There are now 32 living wage champions across the community. We felt it was really important to engage our Chamber of Commerce in this work, and you can see that they are one of the living wage employers in the community. The Public School Board, when they looked at the employees within the Public School Board, they saw that generally they were doing quite well. Lots of their teachers were making living wage, and lots of their support staff were making living wage. Where they weren't paying a living wage was with their janitorial staff. And so that was a gap for them, and they had a pretty serious conversation at the school board of how do we get our janitorial staff up to a living wage, and so they did that in a fairly short order. We have had these conversations with the City of Hamilton. For us, a living wage is really about all of your staff and contractors being paid or paying out a wage that really makes sure that everybody can live successfully, live and work and thrive in the community in an important kind of way. And the gap for the city government, they're just at the precipice of being a living wage employer. The gap for them is contractors. And so they can't guarantee 100% that their contractors are also paying a living wage. And so they're still kind of working through those elements. Another thing is to really, again, starting to address this income disparity is to work at the provincial government level and to really look at how do we not only do the work in Hamilton, but we know that if we can try to really move the needle on poverty for our own citizens, we also have to pay attention to some of the work that's happening at the provincial level and also at the federal government level. When we started the work in 2005 at the Hamilton Roundtable and with our colleague communities across Canada, there was one province with a poverty reduction strategy. They're all right now, all 10 provinces and all 3 territories in Canada have provincial and territorial poverty reduction strategies. And for us in Ontario, what that meant was that our provincial government committed $16 billion to actually deal with that wage disparity or that income disparity. So if you're a low-income family, you get a child benefit tax transfer that actually moved 40,000 children and their families out of poverty over the course of the last year. So having that impact at a provincial level actually has pretty significant impacts at a local level. Another really big focus, the whole focus on asset building, wealth creation, was a focus on affordable housing and really changing the nature of affordable housing in our community, because there is an affordable housing gap, and also to look at the issue of homelessness and folks that are living in deep poverty. Another critical issue that they focused on at the roundtable, and I don't know if it's quite an issue here in Tasmania or Australia, but we have a lot of predatory lending firms, right? They're practically on every corner in low-income neighbourhoods. And so if you're a family that's vulnerable and living in crisis and the only access that you have to cashing your check of one sort or another is going to a predatory lender and paying interest rates that are outrageous, you know, those are pretty serious concerns. And so that became a big focus of the work. We saw that the concentration of predatory lending across the city of Hamilton was pretty significant, and even more significant in the low-income neighbourhoods. Where the work has led and the impact is that we have decreased the licenses that go to setting up new shops in these neighbourhoods, and the other really important thing is that there's much more messaging around the impacts of predatory lending, and there are new regulations that the City of Hamilton has adopted in terms of the amount of interest that these predatory lending shops can charge in the City of Hamilton. And so it's much more in the favour, not completely in the favour, but it's trending in the favour of low-income families. A critical piece of work that's also happened in Hamilton, again addressing income disparity, is really looking at reforming social assistance. In Canada, and particularly in Ontario, social assistance rates are really set by someone who says, okay, this year we will increase social assistance by 2%. Right? And then next year it's a different amount. It's not evidence-based. It's not really based on what does it cost to live in this community at this time, and is the social assistance rate really relevant to support children, their families, and anyone living in poverty in those communities. And so we've worked with the provincial government and have a private member's bill in front of the provincial government right now to really look at evidence-based social assistance rates that are really based on the cost of living, whether it's the cost of rental housing, whether it's the cost of purchasing food, those supplementary costs that families have to provide so that they can, the children and their families can be successful in those communities. We have been actively involved in the Commission for Social Assistance Reform, which has led to this bill. We're also advocating for a national poverty strategy, and the success is that in September of 2006, the federal government, we have a new federal government. So, you know, as much as sometimes we want to think about, oh, you know, we can never affect change at the federal government level, there are windows of opportunity that, you know, are unanticipated and then appear. But you have to be ready. You have to be ready. You have to have done the work around the Hamilton Roundtable. You have to have successes in your success basket. You have to be able to articulate a compelling case. But our federal government has now announced a national poverty strategy and is investing in, I believe, 16 pilot projects across Canada around this work. We are also building a socially inclusive community, and this really looks at, oh, I'm almost done. This really looks at new infrastructure building and the impact of that on community. So, this is my last slide. How do you do this for your community? And I think it's, you know, It's having that focus. It's having a common agenda. It's really leveraging the resources that already exist in your community, and it's actually tracking your results in a meaningful and purposeful kind of way. You want to create a place where everybody has a voice and can belong, and that you can bring the voices, as they did in Leeds and as they did in Hamilton, where you can bring those voices together in a meaningful way, leverage the resources that exist. Choose a framework. It doesn't have to be collective impact, but choose a framework that works for you and for your community. Keep your values and principles at the very forefront and really inspire your community. I think, we landed on making Hamilton the best place to raise a child. You have every child succeeds. That's how we want to inspire our communities. And then finally, engage those voices of the people that are most impacted by the problem. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Just as the microphone comes on. Liz, thank you very much. Wonderful. So much knowledge, so much hard work, and obviously in that community, some great results. Thank you very much for sharing. I'm sure there may be some questions amongst us. Does anyone have a question for Liz? So much information, Liz. They're all digesting it and taking it on. Any questions? Well, you're around for a couple of days.
Yeah. Can I end by doing something then, if I have a minute? So I don't know if you all follow the writing of a woman named Meg Wheatley, but she inspired us. She's a leader in community change in the United States, and she has a poem that I'd love to read. So this is how I thought I was going to end, and I didn't have a time, so since you don't have questions, I can indulge myself. And the poem is called Turning to One Another. There is no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Ask what's possible, not what's wrong. Keep asking. Notice what you care about. Assume that there are many others that share your dreams. Be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. Talk to the people you know. Talk to the people you don't know. Be intrigued by the differences that you hear. Expect to be surprised. Treasure curiosity more than certainty. Invite in everyone who cares about the work and who cares about what's possible. Acknowledge that everyone is an expert about something. Know that creative solutions come from new connections. Remember that you don't fear people whose stories you know. Real listening always brings people closer together. Trust that meaningful conversations can change your world. Rely on human goodness. Stay together. Meg Wheatley.